Right now, I'm challenging myself to see if I can make 128 Regulation H teams that are each different from one another over the course of 128 days. Why 128, you might ask? At the end of the 128 days, we're going to do something special where we battle every team against each other in a single elimination bracket to see which team emerges on top. There will be some competitively strong teams, there will be some gimmick teams, and there will be some probably a good number of goofs and gaffs in there, so if you want to follow through to the end, subscribe so that you can keep up with each day. But without further ado, let's move on to day 95. Alright everybody, welcome back to another video, and in today's video we are going to be going over a Carbink team. Now we've had Carbink quite a few times already on teams because it's just such a consistent Trick Room Pokemon because it is so very naturally tanky, and its type is not necessarily tanky because you do have a quad weakness at Steel, but we have the ability Sturdy, which allows us to always guaranteed take at least one hit. But there is something that Carbink does really well in this format, and that is using the move Smackdown, because you don't see Smackdown a lot in competitive play because it's usually pretty useless, as it is one of the only 100% accurate Rock type moves, and it's just such a weak base power move that you basically never see it, but it allows you to remove a target's ability to be immune to ground. So flying types can now be hit by ground type moves, levitate Pokemon can now be hit by ground type moves, but there are some additional effects to grounding a Pokemon, especially whenever we have terrains activated. It means that all of our flying type Pokemon, which is just Braviary, actually, will now become grounded Pokemon, which means that they can take advantage of the terrain, as we'll talk about when we talk about Braviary. But for the rest of our Carbink set, we also have the Endeavor for whenever we are low health. We can force the opponent to be on low health. Since Carbink hopefully has up Trick Room, it'll be the fastest Pokemon inside of Trick Room. And since we also have a very high defense, we can use a very strong body press into the opponent to deal good fighting type damage. And we're Terra Dark on Carbink because we want to avoid Prankster taunts theoretically if we're not bringing in DD for whatever reason. And just to make it so that we can guaranteed move at some point, we have the Custap Berry on Carbink, so that if we go down to our Sturdy but we do not have our Trick Room set up, we will get a one-time priority whenever we eat the berry directly on the next turn when we're at low health, and we'll be able to maybe get a cheeky Endeavor into the opponent, or we can still rely on one of our other moves to get the strategy. Not Trick Room though, because the Custap Berry only works for moves that are inside priority, and Trick Room still has negative priority, so it won't allow you to set up Trick Room immediately. Next up, we have the Hisuian Braviary, and Hisuian Braviary is a really good special attacking Pokemon because it has the ability Tinted Lens, which basically means that we get to ignore all Pokemon that resist a move that we use. Just one resistance, not double resistances. That just works out to one resistance basically. But Psychic gets resisted by a lot of types, so it's good to have an expanding force that is basically not being resisted by anything, because there's really not too many Pokemon that have quad resistance to Psychic in the format. But because Braviary is a flying Pokemon, it does not inherently get to take the advantage of the double spread expanding force. It'll only be a single target expanding force, but that's where Carbink's Smackdown comes in, because we can side Smackdown into Braviary, and because we are a flying type, we will be weak to it, which means that it will activate our weakness policy, and since we are Stellar Terra, we can still be weak to the Smackdown, which means it'll still activate our weakness policy. And then ideally with our extremely slow Hisuian Braviary at ×2 and Tinted Lens in order to ignore the resistances. Since we'll be landed and Braviary will now be on the terrain, we'll get the spread expanding force, as well as we also just have the consistent damage in the Air Slash and the Heat Wave for a bit of type coverage, never hurt anybody. And we also have the Roost just in case there is a Sucker Punch Pokemon on the field. Whenever we do not have the Smackdown to be on the terrain, we can just Roost and then they cannot hit us, and then we can side Smackdown into Braviary, and then they won't be able to Sucker Punch Braviary while we have the terrain up. But also Braviary is a decently tanky Pokemon, so going for the Roost does have its uses. Next up, we have our Psychic Terrain Setter, and this is going to be the Indeedee Female. And on this Indeedee Female, we're going with the Terra Fairy Dazzling Gleam, just so that Indeedee can also get in some damage if it needs to against things like Dark types, which we can't really touch super well with Braviary. Then we also have the Follow Me in order to redirect for Carbink in case there's like a single target and a spread attack. That means that Indeedee will go down and Carbink will go down to Sturdy, and then we can just bring in Braviary to get off the strategy. As well as we have the Helping Hand for boosting damage with Indeedee, and we have the Trick Room just in case we don't want to bring Carbink to a match. We can still get up the Trick Room with our Indeedee, and with Rocky Helmet we can make it so that any Pokemon that attacks physically into Indeedee is going to take some damage back, which is pretty crucial in some matches. Next up on the team, I decided to slot on Crabominable for the Steel and Dark types that we can hopefully be slower than with Crabominable, but Crabominable does have some pretty good damage, as that's really the only thing it can afford to do since it has such low defense and special defense stats. But we can get in some good ice type damage with the Ice Hammer because it is 100 base power, which is really strong, just at the cost of 10% accuracy, which does come up more often than I would like it to, but that's just how the game works. An Ice Hammer will also make us slower in the Trick Room so that we can outspeed some Pokemon that we previously didn't inside the Trick Room if it's like an opposing Trick Room team. We also have the Drain Punch for our follow-up stab. Really would like Hammer Arm on Crabominable. I did not realize this before, but Crabominable, as we'll see here, does not have Hammer Arm, which is like, why? It's basically the same thing as Ice Hammer. It's just using your arm and not ice. Side tangent aside, we also have the knockoff for getting rid of the opponent's items, and we have the wide guard since not a lot of people know Crabominable gets wide guard. It's nice to have it to block spread attacks, but also it means that we can lead like Carbink Crabominable and prevent the Carbink from the effects of the spread attacks, because it means that the opponent would have to risk throwing 2 single target attacks into Carbink, and if they do that and Carbink goes down, then we can get off an attack with Crabominable, and then we can just bring in Indeedee to maybe try pressure setting up the Trick Room again. And for Crabominable, we have the Expert Belt, which you don't really see getting used a lot. However, Ice and Fighting are 2 very good offensive types, so I figured we might as well be using Expert Belt in order to boost the damage of our super effective damage. And we have Hyper Cutter, which means that we cannot have our attack lowered by things like Intimidate, which is super helpful for Trick Room Pokemon because it means that we can just keep throwing out attacks and they cannot Intimidate cycle us while we're under the Trick Room. And we're Terra Fire on Crabominable so that we're not weak to things that we were previously weak to, like Fire and Steel types. Next up on this team, I decided to slot on Sceptile, who I originally wanted to be Psychic Seed so that we can get off a Psychic Seed Unburden strategy in order to Shed Tail for either Braviary or Crabominable to make it so that they can take at least 1 attack whenever the Trick Room is going up. But I decided to settle on more of a White Herb strategy since using up the Psychic Seed more often than not kind of felt like a waste whenever we're just going to Shed Tail out. And there are a good number of Intimidate Pokemon in the format, the most notable one being Incineroar, so that we can get our White Herb activated. But if we cannot activate our White Herb from the opponent, we can activate it ourselves by using the Leaf Storm, and Leaf Storm will be a really strong grass type attack that we can throw out 2 times theoretically with the White Herb, and then we get a special attack decrease. But whenever our special attack decreases, we can Shed Tail out by taking half of our health and passing it as a substitute. And then since I wasn't quite sure what to put on as the last move for Sceptile, I decided to put on the Grass Pledge, as since we are using Trick Room and we have a fast Pokemon and a slow Pokemon, we can both use the Grass Pledge and the Fire Pledge whenever we're slow or fast, as when we're fast without Trick Room, we can use Sceptile in order to Grass Pledge and then Fire Pledge to get off a really strong attack, or whenever we have the Trick Room set up, we can use Skeledirge to Fire Pledge and then Grass Pledge, and then Sceptile will be the one using the Fire type attack. And then I decided to put Ghost type on Sceptile just so that we are dodging fake outs, but I think there's probably a better defensive type that you could put on Sceptile here. I'm just not quite sure what it is since we do have the Protect to avoid fake outs anyways. And lastly, we have the Skeledirge, who I decided to slot on again because I wanted a Fire Pledge Pokemon, but Skeledirge is probably the best Fire Pledge Pokemon in my opinion, except for maybe like Hisui and Typhlosion, but Skeledirge is probably the best, slowest Fire Pledge Pokemon, which is pretty awkward title to put on a name plaque, but to boost our special attack, we also have the Torch Song, which will give us some good fire type damage still whenever we're not going for fire play. Actually, they're the same base power now that I look at it. But I mean, Torch Song is still valuable for the special attack boost. And we have the Earth Power and Terra Ground. Since Carbink does have the ability to smack down Pokemon, we can smack them down and then they will be affected by ground type moves, which is nice for especially Levitate Pokemon that use their Levitate to not be weak to ground on things like Terra Steel Hydreigon or Bronzong. We can hit those things with Earth Power now, which is epic. And of course, on Skeledirge, we have the Unaware so that we are unaware of the opponent's stat changes, and we have the Leftovers just for a little bit more longevity. But yeah, that's the basic gist of the team. Let's get into some battles. So first up, we have what looks to be an opposing Trick Room team. Perhaps, I mean, they do have Sinister to sub their Trick Room, but they mostly have a lot of mid-speed mons here. So So they lead Blood Moon, Ursaluna, and Hydreigon here, and we lead Carbink and Crabominable, because if they led Ursaluna, I really wanted them to either have to decide to double into Carbink here or decide to attack into Crabominable. And Hydreigon just goes for the Tailwind, which means Carbink's Sturdy isn't going to be broken no matter what, and they just decide to Blood Moon into Crabominable, which is fine with me, as we go for the Terra Stellar here, and we side activate the Smackdown inside of Trick Room, which activates our weakness policy, and we do get off the Heat Wave, and we burn Hydreigon here, and they do Earth Power Carbink on the next turn, and they just go for the Snarl into Carbink. I was pretty confident that Braviary would be able to take a Dark Pulse on this turn, and Carbink going down means that we now get to bring in Indeedee for the redirection support. But we go for the Expanding Force here in order to take out Ursaluna, and Indeedee goes for the Dazzling Gleam in order to finish off Hydreigon, and now we just have to finish off their last two Pokemon in these last two turns of Trick Room. We go for the Helping Hand with Braviary, and we Heat Wave, and we do miss Milotic, which at least we get to take out Metagross, but it would have been technically not a resisted hit on the Milotic because of the Heat Wave. But on the next turn, we just go for the Helping Hand Expanding Force for the single target into Milotic, and that is able to take out Milotic. So this is ideally how the strategy works out, is that we get off the Trick Room with Carbink, and then we activate Braviary with the Smackdown, and then we just KO the opponent before Trick Room ends. Here we have a bit of a quirky team, as it looks like they're trying to use Eviolite Metatite in order to skill swap the Huge Power onto Slaking, which is, I mean, it's quite a gambit, as they could try getting up Trick Room with like a Rongaroo and stuff and still have a lot of offensive power in the Annihilate and the Archaludon, so I mean, it looks like a worthwhile strategy. We start with Carbink and Indeedee here because I wanted to redirect the Slaking's first hit into Indeedee, or redirect the skill swap, and the opponent goes for the Fake Out but doesn't understand how Psychic Terrain works, and Slaking also doesn't understand how Psychic Terrain works, but we redirected it, so we actually don't get to take out Indeedee there, which means that this next turn could be a little weird, because if the opponent decided to skill swap the Huge Power onto Slaking, they could have actually gotten a hit off with Slaking this turn, I think. But we get the Smackdown into Braviary, which activates the strategy, and they do skill swap for the next turn, but here we just Stellar Terra Braviary, and they try to go for Sucker Punch, but we're on the terrain, so they can in fact not Sucker Punch the Braviary, as we just get the Body Press and Expanding Force into both mods, which KOs both, and we Body Press their Archaludon in order to chip it for over half of its health, which is maybe not so much a chip, but the Expanding Force, again, still going to do a lot of damage to both mons, nearly taking out a Rongaroo, and we can just finish off our Rongaroo next turn with a Body Press. Here we have another team with interesting choices, as they have the Stantler, but they also have Gothitelle, but it doesn't look like they have any form of Perish Trapping. It seems like they're just using Gothitelle in order to keep the opponent from switching in general, which doesn't necessarily go with their strategies, but might lead to a more like they're locked in with me rather than me being locked in with them kind of scenario. So we lead Sceptile and Skeledirge here because I wanted to not only see if the Stantler would come to proc the Sceptile's White Herb, but also because I wanted to get up the Sea of Fire kinda quickly. And Gothitelle does protect here, so we get off the Grass Pledge and Fire Pledge, and that just one-hit KOs the Stantler, who might not have been Eviolite, hard to tell there, but I mean, if it goes down, it goes down. Indeedee decides to follow me here, and we do just the same thing in order to form the big attack, and it nearly KOs Indeedee there, which Indeedee has a special defense boost in order to try and live it, and Sea of Fire is able to pick off Indeedee for the rest of its health, as Gothitelle is brought more down just in case it was Focus Sash, and I double protect here because I wanted to see what the opponent would do, and they decided to Terra Dragon and lock in Dragon Darts with their Dragapult, is what I'm guessing they did, and since we have the White Herb active, the Sceptile is faster than their Dragapult, so we get to use the combined pledge in order to take out their Gothitelle, and now it is just Dragapult left on the field, and we can use Indeedee and Crabominable, and Indeedee can Terra Fairy follow me, and at this point, if the opponent is locked into the Choice Band, there's that missing the Ice Hammer that I mentioned before, but if the Dragapult is Choice Band locked itself into Dragon Darts, it has no way of winning this game anymore. It's also worth noting that if the Dragapult was like Ghost Terra Blast there, we would have brought in Indeedee the same way, and Indeedee would have still redirected. So if they were Choice Band, they were pretty much screwed no matter what they picked with Dragapult, unless they had like a Dark type attack or something. Here we have a Sand team, but they also have the Grassy Terrain support, as they have two different Unburdened Pokemon in both the Drifblim and the Sneasler. It's probably more Drifblim who's the one has the Grassy Seed. So we immediately lead Carbink and Indeedee here, hoping that they would lead a Pokemon that could knock out Indeedee and save Carbink. And they do lead the Excadrill, who could have gone for the Earthquake. However, since they're running grassy terrain, it really doesn't make sense for their Excadrill to have Earthquake, so I wasn't necessarily scared of that option. Also, they would have to like Terra their Sneasler in order to not take a lot of damage on Sneasler, but they swap in Rillaboom here in order to get rid of the Psychic Terrain, which makes perfect sense to me. And they just fake out Indeedee as Sneasler takes Rocky Helmet damage, but Carbink is able to get up the Trick Room, probably thinking Indeedee was going to be the one going for Trick Room there. And now we swap in Braviary as Indeedee was probably not being threatened by too much there, as I was hoping to catch close combat into Braviary this turn, but they actually reveal that they have Terra Dark on Sneasler, which probably means that they could go for Throat Chop, but they Dire Claw into Braviary, and thankfully Braviary's not affected, and now we go Terra Stellar on Braviary, and we do the side smackdown in order to get off the weakness policy, and we go for the Heat Wave, and Rillaboom is actually able to live the Heat Wave, but it does get burned, which this U-turn would not have taken out Braviary, but we would be more threatened by the Sand Chip if we didn't get the burn here, which probably doesn't matter in the grand scheme of the match, as since they've terrestrialized their Sneasler to Dark, we can just start body pressing things with Carbink a little bit more recklessly. But we wanted to Air Slash the Sneasler here with our Stellar Boost, but we catch the Rillaboom instead. But now that their grassy terrain is gone, the Psychic Terrain is ours for the taking, which means they can't fake out our Pokemon since Braviary is grounded. And we get the Air Slash crit to take out Sneasler, but I'm not sure how much that crit mattered at ×2. But they decide to knock off into Carbink, since Carbink is kind of their biggest threat at this point, but they still have Excadrill, but we can bring in Crabominal in order to Wide Guard, and Crabominal does go down to the Iron Head here, but Tyranitar went for the Rock Slide, thankfully, which we were able to pick off the Heat Wave into the Excadrill, and we burn Tyranitar, but burning Tyranitar doesn't matter at this point because we still have Carbink, and they knock off into Braviary here, but we get to Body Press. And lastly, we have a battle against a Fire, Water, Grass team here, but they actually have 2 Dragon Core Breakers instead of just 1 Dragon Core Breaker. But we lead Carbink and Indeedee here, hoping that they don't lead Primarina, and they do in fact not lead Primarina, who would have been the main thing stopping us from getting Carbink set up, and they swap in Primarina here, but we decide to Terra Fairy Indeedee here in order to try and pick off the Hydreigon KO, and we in fact do, which means that Carbink gets off the Trick Room pretty much for free here. I tried smackdowning the Dragonite just kind of for the heck of it, and then getting off some fairy damage with Indeedee, but Primarina goes for the Hyper Voice here, and Carbink is just low enough to where it gets to eat its Custap Berry, which didn't look like it was going to matter there, but we get to Endeavor their Primarina and then take it out with the Dazzling Gleam, which is pretty nice. Dragonite decides to use its Terra to Terra Normal here, but we get another Endeavor into Whimsicott, and then Indeedee is able to take out Whimsicott, and they Stomping Tantrum into Indeedee, but Indeedee actually lives it pretty good, which is nice. They protect Dragonite just to stall out the last turn of Trick Room, and just a little thing here that I didn't actually get to do during the video, but since we have 2 Trick Room Pokemon that are both pretty healthy here, if I thought the Dragonite was going to protect again, I would do a double Trick Room here, where the first Trick Room would break our current Trick Room, meaning that we wouldn't be in Trick Room anymore, and then whenever our second Pokemon sets up Trick Room, it means that we would get another 5 full turns of Trick Room here, which, if I knew Dragonite had Protect, I totally would have gone for it here, but unfortunately, I wasn't quite sure of that being the case, and I didn't feel like losing one of our Pokemon just to recklessly end Trick Room again. But Trick Room ends, and we follow me with Indeedee, and Dragonite knocks itself into the Stomping Tantrum, taking Rocky Helmet damage, and Body Press is able to finish off Dragonite. So really good showing for Carbink in that one, as it really had control of the field with the Endeavor. But yeah, that's the basic gist of how the team works. Smackdown is probably one of my top 2 favorite like niche tech moves, the other one being Flame Burst, which I don't think Flame Burst is actually in the game anymore. But it's just such a fun, unique strategy to side Smackdown into your own Braviary, so that Braviary basically just gets enabled as like a full Psychic type Pokemon that goes crazy with weakness policy. And you could probably afford to swap out Crabominal, Sceptile, or Skeleturge for like an actual ground type like Ursaluna or Blood Ursaluna in order to make this team feel a little bit more cohesive. But that's going to be it for this video, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked it, maybe consider leaving a like on the video, and even consider subscribing, because both of those things help me out an absolute ton, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.